Are the Caribbean nations drowning in debt? With paradise beaches and lush landscapes, the Caribbean may seem like a tropical dream. But beneath the surface lies a harsh reality: soaring public debt that threatens economic stability and impacts the lives of millions. In this video, we dive into the 10 most indebted Caribbean countries in 2025, uncovering the stories behind the numbers, the root causes of these fiscal challenges like natural disasters, reliance on tourism, and small economies, and their far-reaching consequences. Stay tuned to discover which countries are burdened by debt-to-GDP ratios over 100%, how they're fighting back, and what the future holds for this vibrant region. If you're curious about how high debt shapes these nations and what it means for their people, you're in the right place. For decades, many Caribbean nations have grappled with unsustainable borrowing levels. And while several nations have made strides towards economic stability, others remain trapped under the weight of soaring debt burdens. Not only will we list the Caribbean countries with the highest debt to GDP, but we will also take a look into why these high debt is so bad and what the future holds for these nations and its people. Let's break it down together. But before we get started, let's look briefly at how we compare debt. Debt between countries is typically measured using a debt-to-GDP ratio, which compares a nation's total debt to its gross domestic product, GDP. This metric is widely used because it provides a transparent and standardized measure of a country's debt relative to the size of its economy, allowing for comparisons across nations with vastly different economic scales. A high debt-to-GDP ratio is often viewed as a red flag because it indicates that a country's debt exceeds its economic output, raising concerns about its ability to manage or repay that debt without compromising growth or essential services. Not only that, the high debt can erode investor confidence, increase borrowing costs, and reduce fiscal flexibility, a government's ability to pay for essential services, leaving nations vulnerable to financial crisis or austerity. While debt-to-GDP ratios vary widely, for context, Japan has the highest ratio of over 260%. The United States stands at around 120%. And Germany, known for its fiscal prudence, maintains a ratio of roughly 65%. All data is taken from the latest IMF values. At the number 10 spot, with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 66.8%, we have Belize, getting us out of the starting block with a total of US $2.1 billion in public debt. In case you're wondering why Belize is on this Caribbean top 10 list, it's because Belize is a member of the Caribbean community, CARICOM, and is located in Central America on the Caribbean Sea's northeastern coast. Belize has faced a challenging journey with its debt-to-GDP ratio, which has fluctuated significantly over the past decade. At its peak in 2020, Belize's debt-to-GDP ratio soared to approximately 103%, driven by the twin crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic and Hurricane Eta, which devastated key sectors like tourism and agriculture. However, in recent years, Belize has taken measures to address its debt burden, namely through the restructuring of its super bond. In November 2021, the government of Belize repurchased US $553 million, a quarter of the country's total public debt, from bondholders at a 45% discount through a blue loan arranged by the Nature Conservancy, drastically reducing its debt by about 12%. Since then, the country's debt has continued to drop and is expected to do so by 2025. Next on our list is the economic giant and renowned country of Jamaica. Doing much better than other countries on our list, Jamaica's debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 67.8%, which equates to approximately US $14.7 billion in public debt. Unfortunately, Jamaica has been burdened by a high level of debt for decades. For example, back in 2012, the country saw its debt peak at 143.9% of GDP. Recognizing the unsustainable nature of its debt, the government of Jamaica embarked on an ambitious reform program supported by the IMF, focused on fiscal consolidation, structural reforms, and debt restructuring, leading to the reduction of public debt by over 60 percentage points. However, challenges remain. The country continues to face high poverty rates, vulnerability to climate change, and a reliance on tourism and commodity exports. All this does not help a country that has been among the slowest growing economies in the Latin America and the Caribbean region with persistently low productivity growth. Our next country is much smaller than the aforementioned Jamaica, but does not make their debt-to-GDP ratio any less staggering. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 69.6%, or US $1.7 billion in debt, Antigua and Barbuda comes in at our number 8 slot. Antigua and Barbuda's debt-to-GDP, while high, has remained relatively consistent over the decades, showing debt is not necessarily always bad. While the country's debt-to-GDP ratio peaked at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the country's ratio only just hit 100% and has been falling ever since, with a 30 percentage point reduction in just an impressive 4 years. However, this does not mean it's smooth sailing. The country's relatively small size makes it vulnerable to external shocks, not to mention the common challenges of climate disasters and an over-reliance on tourism most Caribbean countries face. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 73.8%, or US $1.97 billion in debt, we have the home of the pitons. St. Lucia comes in at our number 7 slot. St. Lucia also becomes the first country on our list where their debt is trending in the wrong direction, rising steadily over the years. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, St. Lucia's debt-to-GDP ratio was around 60%, a manageable level given its developing economy. However, the pandemic dealt a severe blow to its tourism-dependent economy, causing a sharp contraction in GDP and a surge in public borrowing to address health and social needs. In 2020, the debt-to-GDP ratio peaked at 95%. And even though this value has fallen, concerns still abound about the country's debt sustainability. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Your likes help the YouTube algorithm promote our videos to a broader audience. Thanks for your support. Moving on up the list, we come to our next country with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 75.3%, or US $1.1 billion in debt. Grenada is in our number 7 slot. While 75% seems high, and it is, Grenada has demonstrated remarkable progress in reducing its debt-to-GDP ratio over the last decade from its peak of 105% in 2013. Grenada embarked on an IMF-supported reform program in 2014, which included fiscal consolidation, debt restructuring, and economic diversification efforts. However, the country remains vulnerable to external shocks, such as natural disasters like Hurricane Beryl. The damage caused by Hurricane Beryl led Grenada to become the first country in the world to activate its hurricane clause, which suspended repayment of its next 2 debt repayments for a few months so funds could be focused on recovery. As we break into the top 5 most indebted countries in the Caribbean, we come to another giant economy in the region, in the north, the Bahamas. The Bahamas takes it up a notch with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 81.5%, equating to about $12.5 billion in debt. While not at its highest point in history, before the pandemic, the country was on a dangerously upward trajectory, with its debt peaking at 99.7% during the height of the pandemic. However, as the country's debt continues to decline, the Bahamas remains highly vulnerable to external shocks like Hurricane Dorian, which causes a massive surge in expenditure to rebuild. Looking ahead, the Bahamas' ability to reduce its debt burden will depend on tourism growth and improved borrowing costs. In our number 4 slot, we have another country trending in the wrong direction when it comes to debt to GDP. St. Vincent and the Grenadines. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 87.1%, St. Vincent and the Grenadines hold about US $1.08 billion in public debt, marking 2024 as the most debt owed by the country in its history. The reason for this growth in debt can be blamed on the deterioration of the country's primary fiscal balance, caused by the pandemic and the subsequent volcanic eruption in April 2021, which was compounded by Hurricane Beryl just last year in 2024, causing more than US $300 million in damages. The good news, however, is that the country is projected to begin decreasing its debt by this year, 2025. We now come to the region's most indebted countries, as we come to our number 3 spot, taken by Suriname. Suriname becomes our first country with a debt-to-GDP ratio above 90%, with its debt equating to a whopping $4.48 billion or 90.7% of GDP. Suriname has struggled with a volatile debt-to-GDP ratio in recent years, driven by a combination of economic mismanagement, external shocks, and the decline of key industries. By 2020, the debt-to-GDP ratio had skyrocketed to nearly 150%, one of the highest in the region at the time, due mainly to falling oil and gold revenues, a depreciating currency, and the fiscal pressures of the COVID-19 pandemic. As a result, Suriname entered into a debt restructuring agreement with international creditors and sought support from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, to stabilize its economy. This has led the country to see a downward trajectory of its debt, and with the discovery of substantial offshore oil reserves, the country is hoping to see a similar boom to its neighbor, Guyana. Coming in at our runner-up spot, we have another tiny country with a small economy, Dominica. With a debt-to-GDP ratio of 96.5%, that number may seem like a lot. But with a GDP of only US $750 million, its total debt is far smaller at just US $724 million. Dominica has a history of high debt, hovering above 70% for almost a decade. Dominica's long-time challenge with its debt-to-GDP ratio reflects the vulnerabilities of its small economy to external shocks and natural disasters. The country's debt-to-GDP ratio had slowed and began to turn downwards in 2015. But the devastation caused by Tropical Storm Erica was one of the deadliest and most destructive natural disasters in Dominica. The country has seen a gradual increase in its debt obligations. And in the unenviable number 1 spot of the most indebted Caribbean country with a debt-to-GDP ratio of 103%, Barbados comes in as the most indebted country in the region, owing US $8.42 billion to external creditors. The history of Barbados' debt is not new. Since the global fiscal crisis back in 2008, the country has steadily seen its debt increase year over year, peaking at a whopping 142.8% in 2017. This made it one of the most indebted countries in the world at the time of this recording, only behind Japan, caused by years of fiscal deficits, low economic growth, and unsustainable borrowing. In response, a new government implemented an ambitious debt restructuring program under the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation (BERT) plan, supported by the International Monetary Fund (IMF). Combined with fiscal reforms and economic adjustments, these efforts reduced the debt-to-GDP ratio to approximately 125% by 2023. However, the COVID-19 pandemic reversed some gains as tourism revenues collapsed and public spending increased to address the crisis. The future for Barbados, however, seems bright. Since 2020, the country has consistently decreased its public debt year on year, and the country is set to drop below the 100% figure this year, 2025, for the first time since 2011. Looking ahead, Barbados is committed to further reducing its debt-to-GDP ratio to 60% by the fiscal year 2035-2036 in accordance with the Barbados Economic Recovery and Transformation (BERT) plan. With prudent fiscal management and strong economic growth, do not let the high debt fool you. Barbados is set to have a bright future. The high debt-to-GDP ratios of many Caribbean countries highlight the region's vulnerability to external shocks, natural disasters, and economic reliance on tourism. While the majority of Caribbean countries are trending in the right direction to ensure long-term stability, nations must go beyond fiscal policy to include economic diversification, climate resilience, and fiscal hedging. Nevertheless, the resilience of the region offers hope that with sustained efforts, the Caribbean can achieve a more secure and sustainable economic future. By continuing to prioritize prudent fiscal management and sustainable development, the Caribbean can lay the foundation for a more secure and prosperous future. With determination, innovation, and unity, there's hope for a brighter, stronger future for the Caribbean and its people. What do you think is the biggest challenge Caribbean nations face when it comes to managing high public debt, natural disasters, reliance on tourism, or something else? Which country's recovery efforts or struggles stood out to you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this critical topic. Check out this video on the top 10 best Caribbean economies for 2025. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you'll never miss an update on important Caribbean topics. Your support helps us continue shining a light on the stories that matter in the region. This is Caribbean Focus. See you in the next video.